Thank you, Hazem. Thank you, David. Thank you, I want to thank all our colleagues at Investcorp, at NUSACC and ABANA for making this possible. And I want to thank all the people on this call for taking time from their busy schedule to be with us. It is a true honor and an incredible privilege and delight for me to be with you. It is especially so given that it is the 50th anniversary of NUSACC. And I'd like to join many others in congratulating David and his colleagues and thanking them for all that you do. What I'd like to do is use 5 to 8 minutes, because the whole point of this process is to have a back and forth. 5 to 8 minutes to simply talk about this moment we're living through. And I'm going to pick on a few themes that I believe are defining ones. And then during the Q&A, please feel free to take me wherever you want on those themes or anything else. So let me start by just the obvious observation that this is the second once in a 100-year crisis we've had in the last 13 years. We're not supposed to have these crises, but we've had two. And they both had the potential of being generation defining, meaning having long-term effects, both good and bad. And if you compare the two very quickly, the good news is we learned a lot from the first one. The bad news is that we risk making the same mistake. So let me talk a little bit about that. This is the perspective I'm going to take. So the most common view is, yes, it is another global crisis, but it's different. The one back in 2008 was financial. This one is health. That is correct. But at the core of both crises is the same phenomenon. It is what people call counterparty trust, which is a fancy way of saying the trust you have in the person in front of you in any activity. So 2008 was about banks facing each other, not trusting each other, and walking away. And when that happens, you essentially bring the whole global economy to its knees. Why? Because the financial system is like the oil in your car. No matter how good the engine is, if the oil isn't working, the engine will not work. So there was this lack of trust between two banks, many banks, but between banks, and they stepped away. The answer was someone else comes in and says, trust me. Don't trust each other, trust me. Face me, don't face each other. And that was, of course, the big central banks. This time around, it's also an issue of counterparty risk or counterparty trust. It is two people not trusting each other's health. And what happens when you don't trust someone's health? You step away. And this time around, governments said, you know what, you will step away through lockdowns. So at the root of what we're going through today is the same notion of how do you overcome counterparty trust? How do you restore trust in social activities? And of course, we don't have a central bank that can come and say, trust me. Hopefully we have a vaccine that comes in and says, trust me. But you are dealing with the same trifecta that we're trying to deal with. First, overcoming the counterparty risk that is paralyzing, health, restoring good health. Secondly, maintaining as normal social and economic interactions as you can. And thirdly, respecting individual freedoms, not having to tell people what to do all the time. That is a very difficult equation to sort out. And that is why this crisis wasn't a once and for all hit, but it seems to be a repeated hit. The policy response has learned a lot from last time. And the simple lesson it learned is go big early and keep going big. The phrases you will hear over and over again is whatever it takes, all in, whole of government. And the idea is that you don't want a short-term problem to become a long-term problem. You don't want shops that are shut because of health issues that are viable otherwise to become bankrupt. You don't want people who lose jobs in the short term to have long-term unemployment and become unemployable, especially a big risk for the young, as we know in our part of the world. So you go big and you go early. The trouble when you go big and you go early, and you're not facing a financial crisis that's a one-off hit, but a multiple hit, a repeated hit, is that you start losing resilience. You start losing focus. And if you don't have multilateral collaboration and coordination, you start losing the ability to solve the problem across the board. Delivering vaccine and winning in one country doesn't help you if around you vaccines are being delayed. Why? Because you then have one of two choices. Either allow people to come from outside with different mutations of the virus and undermine your vaccine, or become a fortress, have bunker-like, and that's not good. And the UK right now is dealing with this with respect to the rest of Europe. I say this because as much as we learned from the 2008 crisis, we risk making the same mistake at the global level. And what was that mistake? It was winning the war, but losing the peace. We won the war against a global depression that would have significantly undermined not just our generation, but our kids' generation. We won that war. And today, I think we will win that war again. But we failed to establish the economic and financial peace of high, inclusive, and durable growth. How do I assess whether we're going to make that mistake again? Just look at 4 issues. The first one is dispersion. How big will the differences be between countries in vaccination, in infection, and in economic growth? The bigger the dispersion, the greater the risk of repeating the mistake again. The second one is debt. The immediate response to a crisis is to stop liquidity problems, not being able to meet your payments because of a cash disruption in the short term, stopping liquidity problems from becoming solvency problem, going bankrupt. So what do? You borrow. And we've had the biggest borrowing in a very long time by governments and by the private sector. But not everybody can carry that debt. Is it a problem for the US? No. Is it a problem for some developing countries? Yes. So keep an eye on debt. The third of the 4 things to keep an eye on is inequality. This COVID has been the great unequalizer. It had hit very hard, not just the inequality of income and wealth, but also, and tragically, the inequality of opportunity, both nationally within borders and internationally across borders. And the final thing to look at is the disconnect. Because of the choices we've made in policies over the last few years, financial markets have been totally disconnected from the economy. So-called Wall Street doing very well versus Main Street struggling. Wall Street up here, Main Street down here. How are we going to resolve the disconnect? So as much as we should welcome the incredible work being done by our healthcare workers, by scientists who came up with a vaccine in really astounding period of time, and they should be celebrated and thanked, as much as we should recognize that there's hard work ahead. So let me conclude with 2 practical takeaways that I would argue are of relevance not only to governments and companies, but to households, to individuals. And I say that because on this call, we are privileged to have a really wide range of expertise, professional experiences and responsibilities. So what are those two things? One is success depends on a very simple mix. The mix of resilience, optionality, and agility. Resilience, as opposed to robustness, different. Resilience is the ability to take a hit, to make a mistake, and bounce back. And I say this because we're taking lots of hits and we are likely to make mistakes in a crisis environment. But we need the resilience to be able to bounce back. Most crises can be overcome. Most mistakes are recoverable. But you need resilience. And it's not just financial resilience, it's human resilience, institutional resilience. The second element is optionality. There's a lot we don't know. And optionality is a simple way of saying, keep your mindset open. Be willing to consider things that are fundamentally uncomfortable to you. Don't block them out. Encourage as much cognitive diversity, that means gender diversity, experience diversity, race diversity as possible. Because otherwise, you will not revisit your priors, revisit conventional wisdom that are no longer valid. And then the final element is agility. Having the institutional setup, the human setup to react quickly when we have clarity. So the first takeaway is always ask yourself whether you have that mix. The second takeaway is the importance of realizing that as tragic as this crisis is, and it is truly tragic in terms of lives being lost and disrupted, as much as there are silver linings. From the first day of the crisis, I kept a list of silver linings. And I say this because all of us should have the following in our head, on our computer, or on paper. What we've learned during COVID that we want to keep. What we've done during COVID that we really can't wait to stop doing. And finally, what we have to catch up on quickly. With that, let me stop. Having gone slightly over my 8 minutes, I apologize, and I open to any questions you may have. Thank you again for this incredible privilege and honor.